Good evening. Welcome to the discussion of the documentary, When My Time Comes, a conversation about dying with Diane Rehm. My name is Jim Childress, a professor emeritus at the University of Virginia, a specialist in ethics and bioethics. I'm very pleased to moderate this discussion about this important topic. For the last few decades, the US and other countries have been embroiled in a vigorous and sustained debate about whether medical aid in dying should be legalized. In the US, a process started in Oregon in the late 1990s has now led to the legalization of medical aid in dying in 8 states and the District of Columbia. Another state Supreme Court has also legalized it, and other states are considering it. Many of us have had family members or friends who face difficult choices at the end of life, as happened to Diane Rheem's husband, John, and his struggle with Parkinson's. These personal stories, which are captured so well in When My Time Comes, are crucial to our ongoing conversations about what we should do as a society. In addition, people appeal to different values and invoke different fears in our conversations about whether medical aid in dying should be legalized, and if so, in what circumstances. We will explore some of those matters this evening. Before I introduce our 3 discussants, let me describe how we'll spend the next hour. After 40 minutes or so of focused conversation among the panelists, they will then address some of your questions. You should use the question and answer feature of Zoom to raise questions at any time. And I note that we have at least 2 questions already in the Q and answer box. And Rob Dunningberg and I will screen the questions. He will group them to try to make sure that we can cover as many as possible. And I will pose them to our panelists. Now let me introduce the discussions in alphabetical order. Joe Fab is a producer, director, and writer for this documentary. He is an award-winning documentarian with over 30 years of experience crafting personal, emotional films that benefit from his narrative skills and in-personal, in-depth interviewing. His featured documentaries include Paper Clips, which had a successful theatrical run and was shown on HBO, earning a National Emmy nomination, and Bedford, the Town They Left Behind. Diane Naughton is a journalist and producer who served as the executive producer of When My Time Comes, her first feature film. She's been a partner in 2 film production companies, ATO Pictures and Cavalier Films. She currently serves on the board of the Virginia Film Festival. I had the good fortune of knowing Diane when she was an impressive undergraduate at UVA and subsequently appreciated her writings, for example, on bioethical issues in the Washington Post. Diane Rehm is the key interview subject in the documentary, as well as one of its producers. She really needs no introduction because so many know her as a Peabody awarded journalist and host of the Diane Rehm Show on NPR for over 4 decades. She currently hosts the podcast On My Mind. Her many awards include the National Humanities Award presented by President Obama. She is also the author of When My Time Comes, a companion book to the documentary, which was released earlier this year, just before the pandemic hit. So let me turn now to a few questions for the panelists. And let me start with this. Why did all of you undertake this documentary? In the film, Diane Rehm indicates why she became interested in medical aid in dying because of her husband's Parkinson and his desire for relief and control over when and how he died. But why a documentary? How did all of you become involved in this project, and what did you hope to accomplish through it? Diane Rehm, shall we start with you and then see how others would like to join in?
Actually, Jim, I think it might be better to start with Joe because Joe is the brains behind this whole project, which certainly began with his idea to do the film. So, Joe, I hand it off to you.
Thank you, Diane. Well, as you said, Jim, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've been doing that for a whole bunch of years. And I was looking for something to do about aging or the end of life, and I'd been kicking around various approaches to the subject for probably 5 or more years. I lost a sister, my mother, and my father in the space of 5 years, and that really focused my attention and made me perceive things about the end of life that I guess you have to be close to it in order to really think, or at least I did. And so, one of the subjects that came to my attention was medical aid in dying. And because having seen the deaths that were close to me, I was very conscious of suffering at the end of life. Uh, Medical aid in dying was what I wanted to pursue. I was fortunate to meet Diane Naughton at the Virginia Film Festival in late 2016. And we were just getting to know each other, and we were kicking around the idea of maybe doing something together. And then, as I like to say, I knew that Diane Rehm was interested in medical aid in dying. And I heard that she was going to end a radio show. So I usually say that I was kind of lurking in the bushes, waiting for her to actually quit. And then I pounced when the opportunity came. And I asked her if she'd meet with me and just hear what I had in mind. And she very graciously did. And one of the things about Diane is that she is very thoughtful. She's not rash about anything, but she knew what she was thinking. And when she heard what I had in mind, she very quickly agreed to get involved in this with me. And she is, let's say, once she's in, she's in. And so I had a completely committed Diane Rehm, and very shortly after that, when I told Diane Naughton what looked like it was coming along, I had a very committed executive producer in Diane Naughton, and we took it from there.
Jim, it was kind of serendipitous because, as you said at the outset, my husband, John Rehm, had died of Parkinson's. He had spent 10 long days starving himself, drinking no water, taking no medication, because medical aid in dying, which we will outline a little more in just a moment, it was not available in Maryland, where he was in a nursing home. When I watched him go through that 10-day period, I just knew I had to do something about medical aid in dying. And so when Joe came to me, I think he was rather surprised because we sat across each other at a table in my office at WAMU. And then, after he had finished, and as he was leaving to walk toward the elevator, I said, Joe, I'm in.
Mm.
I
Mm-hmm.
just knew it was the right thing and the right time.
I'll just add to Diane and Joe's story. Joe mentioned that we met at the Virginia Film Festival. I went to watch a screening of Joe's most recent documentary at the time, which was called Not the Last Butterfly. And it wasn't necessarily on my radar, but another documentary filmmaker named Aviva Kempner sent me an email and said, Diane, you really should go and see this film, and you should meet Joe Fab. And so I respected Aviva's judgment on that and decided that I would go and watch the film, and went afterward to meet Joe, which is always the benefit of a festival, is you get to interact with the filmmakers. And being a Diane Rehm fan for many years, driving the carpools and having the radio on, when Joe mentioned this idea that he had, I got very excited about that opportunity. And it's been just a privilege to work with both Diane and Joe for these past 3 years.
So one question that comes to mind for me, knowing that this team worked so beautifully to achieve the goal of an impressive documentary, what obstacles did you face along the way that challenged you greatly, perhaps even tempted you to give up, and how did you overcome them?
I'm going to suppose that you,
Go ahead.
I'm good. Thank you, Diane. I'm going to suppose, Jim, that you're not really asking about the biggest obstacle one always has, which is coming up with money.
No, not about that one.
Okay, well, that got handled, but important, and thanks to these two ladies, it got handled. But I think one of the obstacles was we had to find people who were willing to talk about this. And that is often the case. Making a film, you have to create trust with the people that you would like to have appear in the film. But around such a personal matter, and one where, frankly, when people are personally approaching death, as some of the people we wanted to talk to were, it's quite an intrusion to say, wouldn't you care to sit down with us? Let us come in with lights and sound equipment and take lots of your time and attention. So finding the people who would participate as patients, and then finding those who would help us represent the variety of views that we wanted to have in the film. We knew that a film that was having a point of view, regardless of how wonderful our personal points of view may be and how strongly we may hold them, that's not really a service to viewers. A service to viewers would be to give you the spectrum of what the subject is about and how many different people feel about it. Those who are in favor, in this case, of medical aid in dying, and those who are not. So that's what we set out to do. You have to then find people in all those different kind of attitudes who are willing to work with you. And that was a bit difficult.
I don't think there was ever a point during those 2.5 to 3 years when any of us felt as though we were so frustrated we were going to give up. I don't think that ever entered our minds. But the idea of finding the voices of opposition who would speak out, voices from the Roman Catholic Church, voices from the medical profession, voices from the African American community, who would even entertain the idea of speaking with us on a film about the right to die, was difficult. And Jim, as you may know, the Roman Catholic Church has been the most vocal opponent to medical aid in dying around the country. And despite that, we did have the opportunity and the privilege to speak with a very thoughtful Roman Catholic priest and an absolutely wonderful AME pastor who welcomed us into his church during a service and actually introduced me during that service. And I spoke with a physician in Oregon, the first state that had passed it, who was totally, totally against it, but was nevertheless willing to speak to us. And Joe and Diane both really did so much research to find those good voices, and they do speak well.
If I could just add one counterpoint to the people that it was difficult to get. And I don't know how many of the folks who are tuned in for this conversation right now have already watched the film. But if you have not, one of the things you are going to see, or one of the people you're going to meet, is Diane's high school sweetheart, a man named Bill Roberts. And I know that Bill's wife, Irene, is here with us today, listening in. So hi, Irene.
Hi, Irene.
And now here was someone, I pass this back to Diane Rehm, but Diane, you could tell us about who Bill was and where he was at the point we were talking to him.
Well, Bill Roberts, Jim, was my high school sweetheart. We were together for our senior year. We were together for our senior prom. We were voted the cutest couple in the class. And sadly, I learned, and Bill and I had kept in touch over the many, many years of both of our marriages by phone, when email came along by email. And when I found out that he did have prostate cancer that had spread to the rest of his bones and was truly taking his life, I asked both him and his lovely wife, Irene, whether they would be willing to be a part of the film. And they were both so gracious. And Bill is funny throughout. His sense of humor, which he had way back in high school, endures throughout this film. And sadly, Bill did die after we had finished the film, and Irene is now out there in Colorado. I've been worried about her because of the fires near Boulder, but I shall be in touch with her. And that's the story of our darling Bill Roberts.
So let me ask a question to understand a little better the source of the opposition to participating in the documentary by some of those who are opposed to medical aid in dying. Now, one could say, well, this would be an opportunity to present the opposing view. Were they concerned that the documentary had a viewpoint, namely being largely pro-medical aid in dying, if they didn't want to be associated with a documentary that had that direction, or what? Why would they not be willing to take part?
Diane Naughton, you want to take
Yeah,
that?
I'd be glad to. I do think that the concern was that we were not going to present a balanced view. And Diane Rheem's view on this issue is known. So when we presented it, I think that they didn't trust that we were going to be fair and balanced in how we presented all arguments, including their own. So Diane's reputation as a very fair and just your integrity, Diane, took us quite far in trying to get the cooperation of some of these people. Her reputation for civic discourse was very well known over the many years of her radio show. So I think that helped quite a bit to kind of calm people and realize that we weren't getting into a shouting match. We weren't 60 Minutes coming in to do an expose, that we really wanted to have a civil dialogue about what it meant to have choice or not at the end of your life.
And I can assure you, Jim, that there was not one person we interviewed who said, "I'm done. I'm leaving.
I'm leaving, okay.
I'm not talking."
All right, okay. So in the course of participating in, observing these conversations over the few years you were working on this, did your own views on medical aid in dying change at all? Were they challenged in certain ways? Did you come to a different understanding of anything? How did all of you come through this?
Jim, I must say, I came to have a greater appreciation of both the depth of feeling of those who believe that the right to die should be a very personal decision, as well as understanding more clearly the concerns of those. For example, I told you about our wonderful AME minister, the Reverend Lamar, who explained to me that the African American community has very little trust in the United States medical profession, that they have been subjected to not only horrific and unbelievable experiments like Tuskegee, but as you and I well know, in this country, what happens to white patients is very different from what happens to Black patients. The level of medical provision for each group is so different. And he finally ended up saying something to the effect, "Diane, if you can guarantee me that there will be no pressure placed on an African American, if you can guarantee me that there will not be pressure from anyone to make sure that someone who does not want to die dies," he said, "I'll support you. But until that time comes," he said, "I just cannot support it." So I came to understand those feelings far more deeply. As I said earlier, as far as the church is concerned, I support 100% those who believe that God should be the only decider. I support everyone who says, "I want everything medical science can provide." And what I'd like is for those other people to support me in my choice for medical aid in dying. And I think that what we've tried to do is to lay out the beginnings of a discussion to urge people to have these discussions in their own homes, with their own families, with their doctors. Not just one conversation, but many, many. And that's what I hope both the film and my book, which is absolutely taken from the film, will do.
So you've encountered many personal stories along the way. Did any of those have a particular impact on you that you felt were so central to this? And of course, there are several in the film and others in the book. And you might say at some point in this conversation, Diane, exactly how the book differs from and augments or enhances or goes beyond the documentaries. You know, we often say, well, I've seen the film, I don't need to read the book. But in this case, I assume there's a reason for reading the book too, right?
There is a reason for reading the book. Number one reason is that Charlottesville's own John Grisham, a most wonderful writer, has written the introduction to the book because he supports medical aid in dying. Another reason to read the book is that while we did 45 or 50 interviews, I took 25 of those interviews and then wrote an introduction to each one, setting the stage, talking about what we were going into as we went into each of those interviews. So the paperback of that book is coming out in January, just before PBS launches this documentary in a shortened version. Joe, you can probably say lots more about that.
Well, I think you pretty much said it, but there is something I'd like us to be sure we do, and that is to make sure that the folks who are joining us here know what medical aid in dying is. I don't want to go too far with the assumption that they do. So I'll just put out the simple version, and then you can see the film and you can do further research to learn more. There's plenty to learn. But medical aid in dying is the practice by which a patient who is terminally ill and who has a prognosis of 6 months or less, and who meets certain rather stringent criteria that are too many to mention right now, that person can request of their physician that they be prescribed a medication that will allow them to end their life when the suffering from this disease becomes greater than they feel they can bear.
Or the suffering from the treatment, Joe.
Or the treatments, indeed. And so, as I said, there's many other aspects to this, but that's the gist of it. And for me, back to the question about what did I learn or what surprised me, it isn't that I was surprised by this, but to see it in people that we talked with in person was completely different from knowing it intellectually. And that is that having the knowledge that you do not have to suffer, that there is an alternative to suffering, gives people I think a really different view of the end of their life. It just shifts it dramatically to know that, for example, one person that Diane interviewed mentioned that she didn't want her 12-year-old son to have to watch her die of breast cancer the way that she thought she might have to die in front of him, slowly and painfully. But then just for people who themselves, for their own feeling, don't want to be in agony for whatever period of time their disease may be promising them that they're going to have. So to see that in person and to feel their really genuine relief at some alternative to suffering it had a huge impact on me.
I think one other question that has come up so often is, what is the difference between medical aid in dying and suicide? And Lori Pushanowski put it perfectly. She is the very woman that Joe was talking about. She said, if I had my druthers, and she was 37 when we spoke with her, if I had my druthers, she said, I would live until I was 90. I don't have that option. She said, I know I am going to die soon, and I want to be in charge of when I die. People who wish to commit suicide have a choice. They can either live or they can take their own lives. People who are dying do not have that choice. And in my mind, that makes all the difference in the world.
And of course, that terminology has become a matter of sort of debate with opponents of medical aid in dying, often labeling it physician-assisted suicide.
Exactly.
And proponents of it disputing the label. But as you know, terms have a way then of characterizing sort of background positions and not simply the substance of it. So one of the powerful statements in the film, I think, comes from the state legislator in Maryland. I believe he made the comment that we're just one bad death away from supporting legalization. So going back to Joe's point about seeing, so we don't have here simply abstract ideas competing with each other, but rather we have ideas and values embedded in people's lives as they're trying to think about what to do and what to do with loved ones. And if I understood Joe correctly, that seemed to be an important part of what he gained from this process. What about other personal stories that were powerful for you, that had such an impact on you as you were preparing this?
Diane?
I think that we also saw among most of the patients that we spoke with that this decision of asking for medical aid in dying is a decision that isn't made lightly, and that it's one that it needs to be discussed with family and with doctors, so that it really is part of the whole process of considering how you're going to live the rest of your life. And I think that impressed me quite a bit. And I think we heard that from Lori, certainly, who's the breast cancer patient we were just discussing, but we also heard it from Roger, and we heard it from Deborah. And Deborah is the one patient that we followed who actually did use medical aid in dying at the end of her life. She just passed away this year. She was the one that sat in the film. For those that have seen the film, she sat with Dr. Shavelson, with Lonnie Shavelson, at her home, and they talked about this. And he was in attendance at her death earlier this spring. And she did use the law, the California law, the End of Life Option Act. But Lori actually, while having the option of medical aid in dying available to her, and it was quite a comfort to her until the very end, she ended up not using the medication.
And that's such an important point, Diane, because 1/3 approximately of those who receive the medication, who've been designated by 2 physicians as being within 6 months of death. 1/3 of those individuals decide not to use it. My dear friend Bill Roberts did not use it. In the end, he said to his wife Irene when she asked him whether he'd like the medication, the answer was no. He died with hospice care. So it is that comfort of knowing that that medication is there that can make all the difference in the world.
Great. We liked talking about this image of the end-of-life toolbox, and it's an image that Dr. Zitter shared with us as well, that hospice and palliative care and end-of-life medical aid in dying are all options that can be considered part of that toolbox, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive.
You know, one aspect of this film and of the book, which I hope makes its way into the broader world, I hope it gets into medical schools, because it seems to be the younger doctors who are more open to the idea of understanding that suffering is not a goal unto itself, that suffering is not something that patients should have to live through. In fact, attending a lecture we all did given by Dr. Grube, who is the medical advisor to Compassion and Choices, one of the major groups in this field, said that pain is not the #1 reason that individuals finally decide they wish to use medical aid in dying. Rather, it is the lack of joy in life. #1. And #6 on that list of researchers is pain. So it was very interesting to listen to his lecture, to then talk with the students, second-year medical students, before and after the lecture, and to hear their comments about how they had been impressed by what he had said. So I hope that this film and this book make their way into medical schools for that kind of learning.
Diane, something that goes with what you just said about Dr. Grube and the things we learned from him is that he wrapped all of those reasons for people feeling they wish to have medical aid in dying, he wrapped them in the idea, again, of patient autonomy. And he made it very clear that he believes the patient is who will define what is too much suffering. So if too much suffering is pain for that patient, that's up to the patient to determine. And if it is the lack of joy or any of the other possible causes for them to say that they are suffering, they get to say what suffering is for themselves.
The important distinction between pain and suffering, since suffering can involve a lot more, including the lack of joy that Diane mentioned. If it's okay with the panelists, we do have several questions from the audience. Shall I turn to some of those now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. One from Chris Dunn. I understand that in order to get assistance, you must be within 6 months of dying. How does this work in the case of Alzheimer's? My biggest fear, and I mentioned earlier that there's so many fears that are involved on both sides of the debate. Anyone want to respond to that?
That question has come up in every single interview I've done. And it is, as Mary Che, one of the DC City Council members, put it, a step too far right now. There are so many people who, facing Alzheimer's, wish that they could have this option as well. And in fact, as you may know, Jim, at the end of the film, I video recorded with my grandson my own strong feelings about being aware, being made aware of my behavior should it begin to go from me, that I would not wish to continue my life. I have seen so many individuals and families who have suffered so mightily because of Alzheimer's. And of course, in parts of Europe, in parts of the world, doctors are willing to take a life when Alzheimer's is present. But right now in this country, we have 9 states, as you said, plus DC. What we need to do is to get more states, more state legislatures to understand the need for medical aid in dying, and then perhaps to have more families talk among themselves as to what those family members really want. Right now, it's a step too far.
And there was another version of this question as well. Of course, this would be a big step. It would move from the patient then performing the final act, bringing about the end for himself or herself, to someone else performing it. And that is, you described earlier, a step too far within current views, and many would argue that it may be a step too far generally, but at any rate, it certainly
not necessarily. You may have read in the New York Times Magazine 2 years or so ago about a couple married for 40 years or so. She developed Alzheimer's, and they decided that when the time came, when she knew she was going to pass that threshold, when she could no longer take her own life, that she was going to make sure to take it before she reached that point. And they agreed on the timing. Their children knew about it. And that's how it went. And that's what I want for myself, should that happen to me. So I think there's a lot more discussion that needs to happen in regard to Alzheimer's.
Certainly. And of course, part of the issue is legalization versus what individuals, couples make decisions.
Of course.
That's an important distinction to draw.
Jim, if I can add one thing here to what Diane has said, is that on our website, the film does have a website. It's whenmytimecomes.movie.com. We link to a lot of resources, and this issue of Alzheimer's and end-of-life choice is one that the Compassion and Choices group has given a lot of thought to. They do have a dementia advanced directive. Joe, is that the title of it? It's I think, or a dementia.
It's a questionnaire, Diane.
Okay, thank you.
So that people can fill it out and say, well, would this be too far for you to go? Would this be a problem for you to live with? Would lack of this be a problem? So it's very well done.
There are some good resources, and you can reach those through our website. Because again, Alzheimer's is sadly going to impact a lot more people than terminal illness of the kind that's now covered by these laws.
What we tend to think of with a 6-month limit, et cetera.
Right, right.
So a couple of questions that connect on medical students and practicing physicians. So one Christian Goodwin says, I'm a medical student myself who's worked in palliative care research. Who do you think should be in charge of this part of medicine? Palliative care physicians, primary care, or is there a branch of medicine or society that's best tasked to facilitate aid in dying?
I would say all of the above. I have spoken with my own physician, so she knows exactly how I feel. She has put it into my medical records. So God forbid, should I go to a hospital, I hope that those records will be there indicating I do not want any life-sustaining equipment applied. I'm 84 years old. I've had a great life. If the end comes, I hope it comes peacefully, not in a hospital linked to any kind of artificial life-sustaining means.
Could I take that point of departure and say that what Diane described about wanting to die at home is something that an enormous percentage, I think it's something close to 80% of people polled say that's what they want, but fewer than 20% of us actually get it. And this underscores the second theme of our film, which is to have your end-of-life conversations with your family and friends and physicians early, early and in great detail. The idea that you would find yourself or your family would find themselves trying to figure out what you want in the emergency of death, or when death seems to be, days or hours away. That's the worst time to try and sort these things out. If we will just bring ourselves to face the fact that we're all going to die, and it will be a much different experience, a much more positive experience if we will have already thought about what we want and express that to the people who will then help us when the time comes. So I think that second theme, I want to make sure we have put that out there.
And, neighborhoods and church groups and friendly groups have begun doing death cafes around the country. And we all attended one in Falmouth, Massachusetts. And someone said to me the other day, before she viewed the film, I was scared to death to hear about death cafes. And then she said, when I saw it, I felt so much better about it. And as you all present it, it makes so much sense. So I would encourage people who are watching, who have seen the film, to think about establishing your own death cafe, perhaps with a potluck supper, perhaps with dessert and coffee, or my favorite, a vodka and tonic, and enjoy yourself while you talk about what it is you would like to have at the end of life.
It will be easier in the post-COVID world to do that.
You could do it by Zoom, Jim.
That's right. You can do it by Zoom.
Yeah.
We lose something that way, but we could do it by Zoom.
Yes.
So related question about medical school, it's fine to put the content in medical school this is from an anonymous attendee, but how do you get this into information to millions of practicing physicians as people who are already out there? Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a pretty big job. One of the things that I think we all learned particularly when we were in California, was because there, as people will see in the film, we spent time with this physician, Lonnie Shavelson. Lonnie Shavelson, coming from a very interesting family background that had him thinking about death at a very young age, and the idea, had a mother who was sort of a hypochondriac and was telling him that if she ever got in trouble, she wanted him to kill her. That's when he was 14 years old. So he started thinking about this kind of a subject very early in life. Then he worked in an emergency room. Eventually, he came to create the practice that he has now, which is entirely to serve patients in California who are seeking to use medical aid in dying. That's all he does. And through Lonnie, we learned how huge a challenge it is to inform the public as well as the medical profession about what medical aid in dying is, how it works, what the best practices are. And then, of course, you have to get pharmacists, and there are all kinds of players who have to become engaged. So the education question is absolutely about medical schools, where we have young physicians coming up who, as Diane said, may be more open to the idea. But the education is enormous for everybody. And that, back to an earlier question, that's why we made the film, was to crack that topic open with people in all these areas and get the education further stimulated, if we could. For medical schools, I know we have met with a few people in sort of the longer view for the film and for the book to try and get it inserted in these places. We haven't cracked it yet, but we're working on it.
The influencers are really going to be other physicians, I think, on this. So Diane, you met recently with the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, or is that coming up?
That's coming up.
Coming up, okay.
Yeah.
So I think getting these, a critical volume of doctors who are willing to talk about this, as Dr. Shavelson has gone out and done conferences and speak. I think it's still considered somewhat of a fringe thing for these doctors to go out and talk about this issue. So Dr. Zitter, who I mentioned before, she's another one who's out there being very vocal about just end of life in general and issues that come up.
And she is talking primarily about palliative care, if you recall, Diane, because at one point I asked Dr. Zitter, is there ever a point where you say to a patient, I'm sorry, we've done everything we can do. There's nothing more I can do. And she said, I would never say that to a patient. There's always something we can do. Well, I worry about that a little bit. I worry about giving that patient another treatment, another medication that may extend life by a week or two or a month or two. But what about quality of life? That's what I would certainly want to preserve for myself. And I think it's hard for doctors to say there's nothing more we can do.
So in addition to the public and physicians, there are obviously questions about policymakers. And one question that has come up is whether the Virginia legislature has held any hearings on this, and what you think are the prospects of a law in this state that would allow medical aid in dying.
Virginia is at the very beginning of the long slog that it takes to get a law passed. There was a law, or rather a bill proposed in the last session that did not make it really beyond just being raised. It will happen again this year or this coming session. I would think after the 1st of January, thereabouts. For those who may be interested in engaging in this in Virginia, I think what you should do is there is and I think Judy is out here on the chat. She can correct me if I'm wrong, but we need volunteers, first of all. We need people to work on this, communicate about it, go to lobbying days, talk to their own representatives in the legislature about it. But you can go to, I believe the Facebook page is Compassion and Choices of Virginia. And let's see, I'm gonna get you, well, I'm looking for the answer for you. But there is a place for you to volunteer, and I would recommend that you do it. It is, as I say, a long slog. And I was there for Lobby Day this past January when we went around to offices and spoke to legislators. And I think unexpectedly, I think it's safe to say that, the Catholic Church had put together what to us was a surprise event on the morning of Lobby Day, where once again, a very well-funded and aggressive anti-medical aid in dying group had a press conference and kind of took over the news of the day on this subject. So it's a lot of work, but please join in.
So maybe one more question, and that builds on, in part, on Joe, your comment earlier, and some of Diane's comments about how to begin conversations with loved ones who are not interested in discussing anything about medical aid in dying. And of course, as we've heard in this conversation, it's often much broader than that. It's not simply about medical aid in dying, but rather under what circumstances would you want certain treatments not to be provided, et cetera, et cetera. Any thoughts on this?
If I were younger and dealing with parents, I think I might begin by saying something to the effect of, you know, Dad, I have been thinking a lot lately about my own death and my own kids and how I want my life to end. I know that that may sound morbid, but I'm wondering whether you've thought about it at all. And ditto, from an older person's view, I said to my own children, you know, I really need you to understand how I feel. But again, it's not one conversation. It is many conversations. And starting small and starting slow and then leaving it and then coming back to it. Diane, you may have some other thoughts.
Sitting together and watching our film is a great way to get to start off. there's a conversation. There's also Ellen Goodman, formerly of the Boston Globe, has a lovely, just very well thought out resource called the Conversation Project. And if you go to her website, she will send you a guide for how to have this conversation. It is not easy, but I think Ellen's made it about as easy and clear as possible. So I would suggest that as well. And we have links to that on our website too.
So as we wrap up this, let me just raise a question playing on the title of the documentary and Diane's book. Is medical aid in dying an idea whose time has come? Well, we can expect conversations and even heated debates about this to continue, in part because of conflicting values, and I noted earlier, and because of conflicting fears. We can certainly thank Diane Rehm, Joe Fab, and Diane Naughton, and others who worked with them, including those who consented to be interviewed for the project, for providing access to a rich array of powerful conversations in the documentary and tonight, and also the book that Diane Rehm has written, When My Time Comes. Thank you, all of you, Joe, Diane Rehm, Diane Naughton, and all of you who participated tonight for joining in this conversation. We're grateful.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.